June 15, 1944. Saipan Island, Mariana Islands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach as Lieutenant Colonel Kiyoshi Yamamoto surveyed the defensive line his men had constructed. From his elevated position on the ridge, the white-capped waves of the Philippine Sea looked deceptively peaceful. Our preparations are complete. The Americans will never penetrate this position, Yamamoto assured his staff officers, pointing to the wide lagoon that separated the reef from their fortified positions. Their tanks will be trapped at the reef's edge, and our anti-tank guns will turn them to scrap. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What the Japanese defenders of Saipan didn't realize was that the coming battle would reveal a technological capability that would fundamentally alter their understanding of American armor tactics and ultimately contribute to the psychological collapse of their island defense strategy. The Imperial Japanese Army had developed their Pacific defensive doctrine based on hard-learned lessons from previous island engagements. Colonel Yamamoto had personally studied reports from Tarawa and knew that coral reefs presented a natural barrier that American armor couldn't overcome. His 43rd Infantry Regiment had spent weeks fortifying positions overlooking the lagoon, where the water depth ranged from 4 to 6 feet between the reef and shore. Our intelligence indicates the Americans possess approximately 500 Sherman tanks in this theater, explained Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, Yamamoto's intelligence officer, as they reviewed their maps in the command bunker. However, their maximum wading depth without modification is only 36 inches. The lagoon here is twice that in most areas. Excellent, Yamamoto nodded, tracing his finger along the defensive line they had established 200 yards inland from the beach. Position the Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns here, here, and here. When their landing craft discharge tanks at the reef edge, they'll become stranded. That's when we destroy them. Sergeant Major Takeo Ishikawa, a veteran of the Shanghai campaign and Guadalcanal, cleared his throat. Sir, what if they attempt to bring engineering equipment to build causeways, as they did at Tarawa? Our artillery will prevent that, Yamamoto replied confidently. The Americans rely too heavily on their technological superiority. Without their tanks to support the infantry, we'll drive them back into the sea. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Calvert, 13 miles offshore from Saipan, Lieutenant James Wilson of the 4th Marine Division studied the same stretch of coastline through binoculars. The 25-year-old tank commander from Nebraska had been briefed on the challenging landing conditions they would face the next morning. Gentlemen, this won't be like Tarawa, Colonel Robert Newell told the assembled tank company commanders in the ship's briefing room. 8th Army has provided us with the new deep-water fording kits for our Shermans. Your tanks can now wade through 6 feet of water, more than enough to cross the lagoon. Lieutenant Wilson examined the technical diagrams showing the modifications to their M4A2 Sherman tanks. Each vehicle had been fitted with extended air intake and exhaust ducts that rose 5 feet above the tank's deck, allowing the engine to breathe while the hull was submerged. Waterproofing compounds sealed electrical connections, and the crew compartments had been made watertight with special gaskets and seals. The Japanese have established their main defensive line beyond the beach. Believing their natural moat will stop our armor, Colonel Newell continued, pointing to intelligence photographs. They don't know about our deep wading capability. We'll exploit this surprise to the fullest. Captain Michael Reynolds, Wilson's battalion commander, added, according to intelligence, the Japanese have deployed approximately 36 Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns and 24 Type 94 37mm guns across the landing zones. They've positioned them to target vehicles stranded at the reef's edge, exactly where we won't be. The assembled officers studied the production statistics for their Sherman tanks. The United States had manufactured 49 234 Sherman tanks of all variants by mid-1944, outproducing Japan's entire tank production by a factor of nearly 10 to 1. While the Japanese army on Saipan had fewer than 60 light tanks, mostly obsolete Type 95 Hago models, the landing force would deploy over 200 Shermans with the new deep wading equipment. "One final note," Colonel Newell said, his voice grave. "The Japanese do not know about this capability. Intelligence security is paramount. This technological surprise may save hundreds of American lives tomorrow." As dawn broke on June 15, 1944, the greatest amphibious assault in the Central Pacific Campaign began. The USS Tennessee, California, and Maryland unleashed their 14-inch guns against Japanese positions, while aircraft from Admiral Mitch's Task Force 58 pounded the island. Under this umbrella of fire, the first wave of Amtraks carried infantry toward blue and yellow beaches. From his observation post, Colonel Yamamoto watched with grim satisfaction as the preliminary bombardment lifted and shifted inland. "Just as we anticipated, their landing craft are stopping at the reef edge," he said, lowering his binoculars. Captain Tanaka nodded. "The reef is approximately 700 yards from shore. Their infantry will be exposed crossing the lagoon." What they witnessed next left them momentarily speechless. Behind the first wave of Amtraks came the unmistakable silhouettes of Sherman tanks, not halting at the reef but continuing forward, ploughing through the lagoon with only their turrets and strange vertical pipes visible above the water. "Impossible," Yamamoto whispered, raising his binoculars again. "Their tanks cannot. They should not be able to." "Sir!" Sergeant Major Ishikawa called urgently. "American tanks are crossing the lagoon under their own power. They're advancing directly toward our positions." Lieutenant James Wilson sat tensely in the commander's position of his Sherman, hatch closed and sealed. The tank's interior was hot and filled with the loud rumble of the engine as it pushed through 4 feet of water. Through his periscope, he could see the water sloshing just below the top of the hull, occasionally splashing against the base of his extended air intake stack. "Driver, maintain course, speed steady," Wilson ordered over the intercom. "Gunner, watch for targets along the tree line." Corporal David Martinez, the tank's driver, kept the Sherman moving steadily forward at 5 miles per hour. "Water depth increasing, sir," he reported. "We're at about 5 feet now." "The waterproofing is holding," added Sergeant Frank Reynolds, the tank's gunner. "Engine temperature normal." Wilson's tank was one of 15 Shermans from Charlie Company making the crossing. Around them, more tanks from other companies created an armored wave advancing inexorably toward the shore, water breaking against their hulls. What looked like mechanical sea monsters to the Japanese defenders was in fact the result of American industrial ingenuity, a capability developed and produced at a scale the Japanese couldn't comprehend. On the ridge, the Japanese officers watched in disbelief as 30 Sherman tanks emerged from the lagoon onto the beach, water cascading from their hulls as their tracks gripped the sand. Instead of being trapped at the reef as planned, American armor was now deploying directly in front of their positions, neutralizing weeks of defensive preparation. "Adjust the anti-tank guns," Yamamoto ordered urgently. "Target the tanks on the beach." But the Japanese gun crews, positioned to engage targets stranded at the reef, now had to reorient their weapons. This crucial delay gave the American tanks time to spread out and begin engaging Japanese pillboxes and bunkers along the shoreline. Lieutenant Wilson's tank crested the beach berm, its engine straining as water continued to drain from various compartments. "Forward to phase line Alpha," he ordered. "Target bunkers and anti-tank positions." His gunner quickly identified a camouflage Type 1 47mm gun position. "Anti-tank gun, 2 o'clock, 300 yards. Fire when ready," Wilson commanded. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared, sending a high-explosive shell into the Japanese position. The gun and its crew disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. By mid-morning, the American landing had secured a beachhead 2,000 yards wide and 500 yards deep. The Japanese defenders, their carefully planned anti-tank defense neutralized by the unexpected arrival of Sherman tanks across the lagoon, fell back to secondary positions. In his command bunker, now under increasing American artillery fire, Colonel Yamamoto struggled to comprehend the tactical shift. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his intelligence officer. "Your report stated their tanks could not wade in water deeper than 3 feet. Captain Tanaka, his face ashen, could only shake his head. "All previous engagements confirmed this limitation, sir. The Americans must have developed new technology they kept secret from us." Sergeant Major Ishikawa, who had just returned from the front line, added grimly, "Their production capacity is overwhelming, sir. Each destroyed tank is quickly replaced by 2 more. Our anti-tank ammunition is already running low." As night fell on June 15th, Lieutenant Wilson's tank company had pushed almost a mile inland. His crew was exhausted but exhilarated by their success. The deep wading equipment had performed beyond expectations, with only 3 tanks out of 60 developing mechanical problems during the crossing. "We caught them completely by surprise," Captain Reynolds told his assembled tank commanders as they refueled and rearmed behind the front lines. Prisoner interrogations confirmed they had no idea our Shermans could cross the lagoon. "What about casualties?" asked Lieutenant Garcia from 2nd Platoon. "We lost 7 tanks today, mostly to mines and a few to their 47mm guns," Reynolds replied. "That's less than half what we projected. The wading capability saved a lot of lives today, gentlemen." Wilson thought about the statistics they had reviewed before the landing. American factories were producing Sherman tanks at a rate of approximately 1,500 per month. The entire Japanese tank production for 1944 would barely replace what they had lost on Saipan in a single day. The next morning, Colonel Yamamoto received reports that more American tanks were landing, including flame-throwing variants that were devastating their cave positions. The psychological impact on his troops was becoming evident. Soldiers who had been confident in their defensive preparations now whispered about the seemingly endless supply of American armor that could traverse water obstacles that should have been impassable. "The men are calling them water demons," reported Lieutenant Nakamura, who commanded a platoon on the front line. "They believe the Americans possess supernatural technology." Yamamoto bristled at such superstitious talk, but he understood its origin. The Japanese military had never revealed to its troops the true scale of American industrial capacity. Many soldiers genuinely believed that Japan and America were roughly equal in manufacturing capability, making the endless waves of tanks, aircraft, and ships seem almost magical in their appearance. "There is nothing supernatural about American industry," Yamamoto told his officers sternly. "Their factories work around the clock. Their production figures for the Sherman tank alone exceed our entire armored vehicle production since the war began." Captain Tanaka presented the latest intelligence analysis. "According to our estimates, the Americans have landed approximately 160 tanks on Saipan thus far. Our remaining anti-tank capability can engage perhaps 1/3 of that number effectively." As the battle for Saipan continued over the next week, the psychological advantage gained by the Sherman tanks' unexpected water-crossing capability multiplied. Japanese soldiers, already facing overwhelming firepower, now believed that natural obstacles offered no protection against American technological superiority. Lieutenant Wilson witnessed this psychological impact firsthand when his tank captured 3 Japanese soldiers hiding in a collapsed bunker. Through an interpreter, one of the prisoners expressed amazement at seeing the tanks emerge from the lagoon. He says they were told American tanks could not cross water deeper than 1 meter, the interpreter explained. When they saw the Shermans coming through the deep water, many soldiers believed it was some kind of American magic. Wilson had the interpreter explain the reality, that it was not magic but mass production and engineering that allowed the crossing. "Tell him we have thousands more tanks waiting to be deployed," Wilson added, knowing that such information would eventually filter back to other Japanese troops. On June 18th, the Japanese attempted a desperate counterattack against the American beachhead. Colonel Yamamoto had consolidated his remaining armor, 13 Type 95 light tanks, for a night assault against the Marine positions. "We must strike before they bring more tanks ashore," he told his tank commanders. "Their Sherman tanks are superior to ours in armor and firepower, but our crews are more experienced and motivated." The Japanese tanks, weighing just 5 tons compared to the Sherman's 33 tons, had only 12 millimeters of armor and were armed with 37mm guns that could barely penetrate a Sherman's side armor at close range. By comparison, the Sherman's 75mm gun could destroy a Type 95 tank from over 100 yards away. The counterattack began at 0200 hours, with Japanese tanks supported by 500 infantry attempting to break through American lines. Lieutenant Wilson's tank company was in reserve when the alarm sounded. "All tanks move to defensive positions along phase line Baker," Captain Reynolds ordered over the radio. Japanese armor reported moving south along Axis Charlie. Wilson's tank took up position behind a low ridge, its engine idling as the crew peered through their night vision devices. The distinctive high-pitched sound of Japanese tank engines soon became audible. "I count 7, no 8 enemy tanks," reported Sergeant Reynolds from the gunner's position. "Range 600 yards and closing." "Hold fire until they're within 400 yards, Wilson ordered. "Pass the word to other tanks." The Japanese tanks, silhouetted against burning vegetation they themselves had set aflame to blind the American defenders, advanced in a ragged line. Unaware they had been detected, they continued forward until they reached the 400-yard mark. "All tanks open fire," Captain Reynolds commanded over the radio. The night erupted with the muzzle flashes of 12 Sherman tanks firing simultaneously. 8 75mm high explosive shells found their targets, immediately destroying 5 Japanese tanks. The remaining Japanese vehicles attempted to return fire, but their shells bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's frontal armor. Within minutes, the Japanese counterattack collapsed. All 13 tanks were destroyed, and the supporting infantry, deprived of their armored support, were cut down by machine gun fire or forced to retreat. Colonel Yamamoto received the news of the failed counterattack with stoic resignation. "We have lost our remaining armor capability," he noted, making a precise entry in his operations log. "The Americans now have complete mechanized superiority on the island." The psychological effect of this defeat rippled through the Japanese ranks. Soldiers who had been told that spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages were confronted with the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare. A Sherman tank, which could be replaced within hours of its destruction, represented more industrial capacity than many Japanese soldiers had seen in their entire lives. By June 20th, American forces had secured nearly half the island, with Sherman tanks leading each advance. The Japanese defenders, falling back to prepared positions in the mountainous northern sector, found that their anti-tank tactics, developed for an enemy that could not cross water obstacles, were increasingly ineffective. Lieutenant Wilson's tank was now operating in the central plains of Saipan, supporting infantry as they cleared Japanese resistance from sugarcane fields. The deep wading equipment had been removed from the tanks once the beachhead was secure, allowing better engine cooling and visibility. During a lull in the fighting, Wilson discussed the landing with war correspondent Robert Matthews, who was gathering information for an article about the new tank capability. The expression on the faces of the Japanese when our tanks came through that lagoon, "I'll never forget it," Wilson told the reporter. "One prisoner told us they thought we had developed some kind of underwater tanks. Their whole defense was built around us not being able to do what we did." Matthews noted that the Army had produced 5 926 deep wading kits for Sherman tanks between January and May 1944, enough to equip every tank deployed in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese intelligence failure wasn't just about not knowing we had this capability, Matthews observed. It was about not understanding that we could produce it at such scale once we developed it. By June 25th, Colonel Yamamoto's regiment had been reduced to less than 30% of its original strength. In his final report to division headquarters, he specifically mentioned the unexpected American tank capability as a decisive factor in the battle. The ability of American Sherman tanks to wade through 6 feet of water negated our carefully prepared defensive positions, he wrote. This previously unknown capability, combined with their overwhelming numerical superiority, made our anti-tank defenses ineffective. Future defensive planning must account for the possibility that no natural water obstacle less than 3 meters deep will impede American armor. In his personal diary, found later by American forces, Yamamoto made a more candid assessment. "How can we fight an enemy who can make their tanks swim through lagoons? Our soldiers fight with courage and spirit, but against such industrial might, spirit alone is insufficient. The Americans do not simply have better equipment, they have the ability to imagine solutions to problems we thought insurmountable, then produce those solutions by the thousands." Lieutenant Wilson's tank company participated in the final clearing operations on Saipan, which was declared secure on July 9, 1944. The battle had cost the Americans 426 killed and 364 wounded. Of the 0 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1 survived. The rest fought to the death or committed suicide, including many civilians who had been told that Americans would torture and kill them if captured. When Wilson's tank was loaded onto an LST for transport to the next operation, he noticed that shipyard workers had painted a cartoon fish with tank treads on its turret, a humorous recognition of the vehicle's amphibious achievement at Saipan. "We're getting new Shermans with the 76-minuted guns for the next landing," Captain Reynolds informed his company. "Better armor penetration, improved fire control, and the deep wading kits are now standard issue." The industrial statistics were staggering. By the time Saipan fell, American factories had produced enough Sherman tanks to replace everyone lost in the Pacific Theater 3 times over. The deep wading kits, initially an experimental modification, were now being manufactured at a rate of 3 zhou per month, more than the total number of tanks in the entire Japanese army. The technological surprise at Saipan had ripple effects throughout the Pacific. Japanese commanders at Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu revised their defensive plans, no longer relying on water obstacles to channel American armor. But this tactical adjustment could not compensate for the fundamental industrial disparity between the two nations. For Colonel Yamamoto, who died during the final Banzai charge on July 7th, the sight of Sherman tanks emerging from the lagoon represented more than just a tactical surprise. It symbolized the unbridgeable gap between Japanese and American industrial capacity. His final diary entry read, "America does not defeat us with courage or superior fighting spirit. They defeat us with factories." Lieutenant Wilson would go on to participate in 3 more amphibious landings before the war's end. The deep wading Shermans became a standard feature of American island assaults, their distinctive snorkel-like breathing tubes striking fear into Japanese defenders who now knew what they represented. The psychological advantage gained at Saipan, the demonstration that no natural obstacle could protect them from American technological ingenuity contributed significantly to the gradual collapse of Japanese morale. In the years after the war, military historians would point to the Saipan landing as a perfect example of how technological surprise, combined with overwhelming industrial capacity, could have effects far beyond the tactical battlefield. The image of Sherman tanks wading through 6 feet of water came to symbolize American resourcefulness and production power, qualities that ultimately proved more decisive than any single weapon system. For the Japanese officers who first witnessed this capability, it represented a fundamental failure of imagination. They had planned their defenses based on known American limitations, never considering that those limitations might be overcome through engineering and mass production. This failure of imagination, repeated across multiple domains of warfare, ultimately contributed to Japan's defeat as much as any battlefield loss. By war's end, the United States had manufactured 49's 324 Sherman tanks, deploying them across every theater of combat. The deep wading equipment, initially developed specifically for Pacific operations, was later adapted for the European theater, playing a crucial role in river crossings during the advance into Germany. The ability of Sherman tanks to wade through 6 feet of water at Saipan represented more than just a technical achievement. It demonstrated how American industrial might, combined with pragmatic engineering, could overcome seemingly insurmountable natural obstacles. For the Japanese defenders, who watched in disbelief as these steel behemoths emerged from the lagoon, it was a visceral lesson in the new realities of industrial warfare. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.